I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys.
This is Trade Guy Scott. Thanks for listening to The Trade Guys. On this episode, Bill and I talk about the Biden administration's report card at the end of 4 years. We talk a little bit about what we might expect from President-elect Trump as he takes office. And we also discuss the coming together of the BRICs with the addition of Indonesia and the new export control regime on AI chips. All this and more on this episode of The Trade Guys.
Welcome back to The Trade Guys. First of all, we have to wish our very own Bill Reinsch a happy birthday.
Yes, 39 and counting by a lot. One of my children pointed out to me that I said, you know what, I don't really approach these things anymore. And the reaction was, well, better to have them than not to have them. And I think that's certainly true.
Well, the same can be said of inauguration days, which we're recording before the upcoming inauguration day. So you all will have to tune back in next week to hear our reactions to whatever comes out of the first few days of the new administration.
There will be rants.
There will be rants.
Guaranteed.
The change at the White House, as well as USTR, Commerce, et cetera, does give us a good opportunity to step back and take stock of some of the trends in U.S. trade policy over the last 4 years and consider where the next 4 might take us. So, guys, I have 2 questions that I'm sure you both could write treatises on. The first is, what do you consider the successes and failures of the Biden presidency on trade? And second, what are your predictions for Trump's 2.0?
Well, let me kick it off and give you a top line on the Biden administration's trade policy. A lot of it we won't know for a few years just because it takes that much time to be reflected. But I would characterize the policy as sort of timid. First of all, they started off with, as Ambassador Tai articulates it, this notion of worker-centered trade policy, which I never really understood, and I'm not sure they did. It's sort of a piece with, recall President Obama during his administration talked about economics from the middle out. I never really quite grasped that, but it's sort of an odd goal to set. But having said that, there's also tactically, I think they were unable to take the initiative on issues because of objections from progressive left base, who essentially an anti-business perspective on trade negotiations, and the labor movement, who was an important constituency that was skeptical about almost every action with trade. Given that, what we're looking at is relatively few results. We've got no new trade agreements, no new market opening agreements, or things that produce changes such as the USMCA, which happened in the prior administration. So nothing to point to there. No resolution of any of the issues at the multilateral trading system at the WTO. It was in stasis when the administration took office and still it sort of stuck on the same issues. Not a lot of disputes on market access for American firms and industries and farmers. I think there are actually more cases filed under the USMCA rapid response labor provision than there are unfair trade cases on behalf of U.S. exporters toward foreign economies. I may be wrong about that. There are a lot more restrictions on trade. Almost all the Trump tariffs remained in place or were increased in their breadth, and in some cases in the tariff rates. There are a tremendous number of financial sanctions applied. We're now up to 17,000 entities, from entire nation states to individuals, that have some kind of financial sanction on them. And a lot of Buy America provisions which have the effect of restricting trade. So that's kind of the scorecard. So what do I make of that? Well, first, trade policy is a pretty important piece of foreign policy. It's sort of the real politics side of foreign policy. And I think our foreign policy was in some ways hampered, mostly because economic policy helps lubricate things. It helps convince allies and partners to help us out where we need that. That's part of the bargaining that goes on. And it looked to me like all the administration had to offer were lectures. So it was not a particularly productive period as a geopolitical tool for trade. But more importantly, it looks to me like in practice, this notion of trade policy for the middle class, worker-centered trade policy, turned out to be a trap because it's very hard to help workers while you're ignoring or deprioritizing the interests of the firms and industries that employ those workers. I'm not sure this policy ever goes anywhere More importantly, by the time the administration was campaigning, Bidenomics was a weight that nobody could really carry. It was something that the voting public were quite unfavorable toward. And I tried to think about, well, why did Bidenomics fail so decisively the way it did? I mean, we had 2/3 of the country thinking that we were on the wrong track. And the one middle class issue that we didn't address and could have with trade was inflation. I mean, there are lots of causes for inflation, but one of the ways you help cure inflation is to give consumers access to lower priced goods, which is usually what market access opening does. There's lots of other benefits as well. But by the time voters got to decide, it was like, we'll take the orange guy. Final consequence is there was nothing there from a policy standpoint that persuaded voters to continue the agenda. So,
well, yeah, if you want a complete rant, look at my column from the week of January 6th, which went into some detail about Biden in particular. I think that, this is a case with both Biden and Trump of what has become kind of axiomatic about trade policy, which is so many of the issues involve the left and the right ganging up and shooting the center. And what you've got is policies for Trump and Biden that on the surface don't look that much different. Tariffs, reshoring Buy America requirements, but they come from very different philosophical positions. Scott has described the Biden approach. The philosophy is that conventional trade agreements have helped big companies and their CEOs at the expense of workers. And so a trade policy for the workers was designed to fix that. And by reallocating benefits and by promoting reshoring, among other things, Trump's policy is not that. He articulates it as a policy of victimization. The U.S. for years has been a victim of the evil foreigners that are stealing our jobs, undermining our economy, compromising our security. That it's our fault because back in the post-war era, post-World War II era, I think his analysis is we lowered tariffs because we wanted to promote recovery in the part of Europe and also Japan that had been destroyed. But we didn't insist that those countries do the same. In fact, we didn't insist that anybody do the same. So from his perspective, because he has only one tool, tariffs, from his perspective, our tariffs are low and their tariffs are high, and that's fundamentally unfair. This is empirically wrong, but this is what he thinks. The two different philosophies kind of lead them in the same direction, which is in the direction of more protection, basically, and more emphasis on us and a de-emphasis on global growth, global welfare, which means ignoring the reality that we grow fastest when everybody else is growing as well. And that what protection inevitably does is slow down overall macroeconomic growth. There are winners and losers, and protection creates winners, and they're not the same as the winners in an open trade economy. But from a macro perspective, they reduce growth. At the same time, Scott hit on the essence of the Biden policy, which is exactly what I told Ambassador Tai when she first got the job, which is you get judged by what you finish, not by what you start. And as Scott's pointed out, they started a lot, but they didn't finish much of anything. IPEF, APEP, unfinished. Big trade agreements with Europe, Boeing, and the Green Steel and Aluminum Agreement, not finished. Can kicked. What they basically did in both cases was negotiate a ceasefire with decisions to be made later, which have not been made. Bilateral trade agreements, not started. Critical mineral agreements, with the exception of Japan, either not finished, like in Europe, or not begun, with probably half a dozen countries that have hinted that they would like to have one. So it is not a record of accomplishment. It's a record of beginnings. And Ambassador Tai has been writing and giving interviews about sort of retrospective commentaries, which is what you're supposed to do when you're leaving office, and has talked about creating a new paradigm in trade. And it's fair to say that maybe she laid a lot of foundation stones for a new paradigm, but really failed to build on the stones. And with respect to Trump, it's not clear to me that he's going to build on the stones because he has a different narrative. It's a victim narrative. It's a revenge, getting even narrative. It's not a help the worker narrative. He may think it's doing that, but that's not the main point, I don't think. What you will see from him, it's hard to say because he's not in office. Well, we can discuss this in greater detail, I'm sure, on the next multiple podcasts. But we're beginning to see, first of all, procedurally, the same roller coaster we saw in his first term. He's bringing in people with different points of view. They argue. He enjoys that, watches it. When he gets bored, he puts out a tweet, and that stops the debate in terms of whichever way he tilts, at least until he tilts a different way. Then it starts all over again. The difference with Biden, and there were internal differences in the Biden administration, the difference is that with Trump, everybody leaks. And all this stuff ends up in public. And the theory is it's because the people who work for him believe the best way to get his attention is to get their views into the public domain, get their views into the media. If they can get on the morning news on TV, that's better than sending him a memo. So what you get is a lot of leakage and people carrying out their fights in public, people attacking each other in public. And he seems to like that. But what that means is, and you can see it in the stock markets, in the financial markets, every time there's a story, there's a reaction. And 2 weeks ago, there's this flurry of stories that they were going to not do a global tariff, but only do a global tariff on selected items. And that played for about a day. And then Trump tweeted, that's wrong. We're not going to do that. And then again, I think earlier this week, there was another story that his advisors were plotting a more limited course of action. These things are true. I don't have any doubt that his advisors are doing that. I also don't have any doubt that Trump doesn't want to do that. So we'll see what happens on day 1, day 2, day 3. But every time one of these stories come out, the market goes up, the market goes down. It's a roller coaster ride. And I think we're going to see more of that. But we will definitely see tariffs, I think. No question about it.
I think you're right, Bill. Tariff man is still going to be tariff man, and he has his views. What I have noticed, what I'm most interested in is what's different from 4 years ago. My sense is, first, the economy and geopolitics is in a very different state than it was 8 years ago when he first took office in 2017. I think he understands that and is calibrated for it in some ways. He certainly ran a different kind of campaign than he did in 2016. So I'm interested to see how that plays out in policy. Second, he's got a couple of nominees for the Treasury Secretary and the Energy Secretary, Besant and Wright, who have laid out a very ambitious domestic growth plan, which will have implications for trade. But to the extent he delivers on lower energy costs, on lower federal spending and dealing with debt and deficits and deregulation, I think you can accelerate U.S. economic growth. And we'll wind up with moderated inflation, but you'll also wind up with increased demand for foreign goods. So it's going to be a very interesting tussle. I actually think that nominee Besant has laid out a program that, if he delivers on it, would be massive for the U.S. economy because it chooses a higher growth strategy for the long term, as I interpret it. Obviously, I also think that this version of President Trump is more reliant on tariffs as a tool of economic statecraft, not so much as a way to balance unfair practices. A lot of the efforts in his first term were geared toward unfair practices. All the Chinese tariffs were toward bargaining to reduce the level of what he identified through the 301 process and that investigation as unfair practices. He's more now about trying to accomplish things geopolitically with tariffs as the tool in some ways, because, and we'll get to this a little later, I think, he's said on a couple of occasions that sanctions have been overused. He's probably right about that we've reached diminishing returns, certainly on some of the financial sanctions, and they've started to harm us by going too far. So he sees tariffs a little differently and talks about them differently. We'll just see how it gets executed. As far as leaks go, I don't know if we'll see the same pattern that we saw in the first term. I think that he's clearer on the advisors, but I also know the transition team didn't leak much at all. That's a change. So we'll see how it goes. We'll have plenty to talk about in the program.
The other element, which picks up on something you said, is one of the new parts of his narrative is the tariffs are for revenue. And nobody has made a credible argument that the revenue is going to be sufficient to offset the revenue loss from the tax cuts he wants. The problem with Besant's economic program is that it may be as stimulative as Scott describes, but it's going to come with an enormous increase in the national debt. Trillions of additional dollars. Tariff revenue cannot possibly compensate for the increase that's going to occur. And that raises the question of, at some point, that catches up with us.
Yeah, we got to make the math work at some point because it doesn't now.
Right. And what he's going to do is going to make the math worse.
Mm-hmm.
It's a classic case of dumping the next generation with an insoluble problem in order to make short-term gains. The long-term cost to the economy, to my children and my grandchildren, will be significant. short term, people may decide that they're better off, but it's a very short-sighted policy, I think.
So, guys, a notable development in trade over the last 4 years has been the expansion of the BRICS coalition as an alternative to the G7. And just a couple of weeks ago, on January 6th, Indonesia officially joined BRICS as a full member, becoming the first Southeast Asian state to join the bloc and now the 10th full member of BRICS. So, what's the appeal of BRICS to a country like Indonesia? And is the growth of the bloc something the U.S. should or could be working to counteract?
Well, it's hard to say. Look, I'm old enough to remember when BRICS was coined. BRICS was coined as the title of a research report produced by Goldman Sachs Research about 25 years ago that was just a handy little acronym and never amounted to much beyond that research report and the catchy title, and has been a mini version of the UN General Assembly. It's a place for leaders to meet and for speeches to be made. Not much substantive has happened. What I think is going on now is just the BRICS have found an issue. The issue is, as we've moved to this multipolar world, trying to manage risk in their own economies. These are large economies, many of them large commodity exporters with serious trade interests, but not a lot in common. And I think that's always been the difficulty with BRICS. The one thing that candidate Trump reacted to very sharply was the notion of a BRICS currency and settling trades in something other than US dollars. And first, I found it encouraging that candidate Trump, now President-elect Trump, had a clear idea of the importance of the dollar, why it was important as a reserve currency, important as the principal international currency for trade settlements. It will remain that way. It certainly won't be displaced by anything that the BRICS might do. First of all, they don't have a real idea. The last summit that they held indicated that they're going to be issuing a report in a year. So this is a very slow burn on the benefit or the unity associated with some currency or some way to settle trades not in dollars. I think it's going to be a long time coming. But look, the dollar is the principal international currency for a number of reasons, mostly because we have large open markets that are contestable, that are open to foreigners, that allow for deep liquidity pools to happen. And we also have a fiscal and monetary policy that's united. So the dollar gets all the network effects, in other words, and nothing succeeds like success in the settlement business. People take the dollar because everybody else has it. And so it's actually a good medium of exchange from that standpoint. And it wasn't really threatened by either the euro or the RMB. The euro's main difficulty is that fiscal policy is a member state issue, and it's separated from the monetary policy. And the main issue with the RMB is their internal financial system is closed. It's state controlled. And so the BRICS have now the worst of both worlds. First of all, they have a number of countries that don't have unified either fiscal or monetary policy. And many of them don't run open economies. So while there's lots of talk, for instance, about Brazil using some currency other than the dollar to settle, the largest state-owned enterprise in Brazil, Vale, the energy company, issues its debt in US dollars. So there's a message in there somewhere. But everybody's trying to de-risk. And the one way to de-risk is to identify alternatives. And the dollar has some vulnerabilities that we have inflicted on it that we could probably use to correct. One of them is the fiscal excess that's happened has made it less of a store of value. But also sanctions reduce the number of parties. Every time you issue a new financial sanction, there are fewer entities that can use the dollar in settling trades. So we're our own worst enemy in some ways if we get current trajectories of increased government debt and increased sanctions. The dollar will naturally strengthen as the currency of choice. So there's a lot of ground to cover there. Look, I think the president-elect is focused on tariffs because he doesn't want to use sanctions, which I found interesting. He made a speech on this in September about the time there was talk about the dollar as reserve currency. He was quite clear that he understands the benefits of the reserve currency, but he also understands the limitations of financial sanctions, and ultimately they start to backfire on you. So it'll be an interesting space to watch. I don't think the BRICS themselves will manage to get anything specific done pretty soon. But the fact is, de-risking is something of interest to every sovereign. It's of interest to every firm, and everybody's de-risking looks a little bit different.
I've looked at it more politically than economically. I mean, I agree with what Scott said. It seems to me it's never been exactly a cohesive political entity because it began with a negative. It began with countries that did not want to be subsumed into the Western bloc. for various reasons. Russia, China, authoritarian states that have decided it's in their interest to present as best they can a coherent alternative to what they view as Western hegemony. And they want to create an alternative. And I think all the commentary about a BRICs currency and things like that are coming primarily from them, both for philosophical reasons, but also for the practical reasons. They are the primary victims of the sanctions. And so, particularly if you're a Russian entity, if you want to get out from under the sanctions that have been imposed, you need to find non-dollar based ways to conduct your economic transactions. So it's been a place where philosophy and convenience have merged. But India, Brazil, South Africa, these are not authoritarian states. These are democracies. They have actual elections. They all, I think, had a common interest with Russia and China in terms of not wanting to be put inside, I guess, a Western bloc in which they felt they would be inferior players and their place would not be as important as they wanted it to be and as important as they thought their economies justified being. So it was convenient for them to assert their independence of the West. Not that the West is trying to corral them, but perception is everything. As they've now seemed to be embarked on an enlargement mechanism. So Indonesia joined, but so have a number of other countries, including Ethiopia, which is the one lower income country that has joined. The more countries join, the more difficult it will be for them to present a unitary position on anything. I think Indonesia is a country that, like most of the Southeast Asian countries, finds it very much in their interest to, walk the fine line between being too close to the West and too close to the Chinese, the latter being a neighbor and a major trading partner. None of them want to be swallowed up by China, but neither can they ignore China. For them, I think becoming part of BRICS is a way to demonstrate sort of political, in a way, neutrality. That's why I say the bigger BRICS gets, the less cohesive they will be and the less coherent they will be in terms of articulating a single position. So that's something we have to watch, I think. But to close out, I don't see an alternative currency on the horizon, particularly as long as the Chinese RMB is not fully convertible. There's never going to be an alternative currency on the horizon. So it's out there. It's something that is worth watching and monitoring closely. It does not, at least in the case of Indonesia and some of the other new entries, means that they are becoming necessarily anti-American, but it's a way for them to demonstrate that they are not also willing to be subject to what they view as American hegemony.
I want to close with what has been a prominent feature of the Biden trade policy, and that's export controls. So though we're in the last week of the lame duck period, the Biden admin has still been quite active in the economic security space. We just had another sweeping round of export controls impacting AI. So Bill, as our resident export controller, what are these new controls trying to accomplish, and why might they be coming now?
Well, there's a lot of angst in the business community on the latter point. Let's do process first and then substance. They are trying to accomplish a lot in the last 10 days. The new regulation that I'll be talking about is the one that came out on January 13th. It relates to further controls on AI, artificial intelligence chips. But there are supposed to be two more coming out probably on the 16th. They produced one on restrictions on EV imports that contain Chinese or Russian electronics or chips. And they've got another one coming out. Well, that one's an import one. So there's this flurry of activity at the end. This has raised major objections in the business community, and not just the high-tech business community, but the business community generally, on process grounds. I mean, they don't like the rule, which I'll get to in a minute, but they particularly don't like the way it was constructed. That is, in their view, without sufficient consultation and back and forth with private industry on this. And, I think from the private sector's point of view, when I ran the National Foreign Trade Council, we ran into this a lot. You can never have enough consultation for private companies, and they're always going to complain about it. This time, the complaints seem to be much worse than usual, and the evidence seems to be better than usual in the sense that they seem to be pretty clearly to have been ignored by and large in the development of this most recent reg, which I think was rushed in order to get done by the end of the Biden administration. By the way, I think it's not likely to be one that Trump will at least immediately get rid of. It's probably in line with his thinking. So expect it to stick around. These particular regulations are extremely technical. The latest one, I believe, is around 160 pages of the rule. So if you're in the business, there's a lot of details. And if the government doesn't have a good grasp of the details, they're going to make mistakes. And they're going to either over control or under control, or from the business community standpoint, almost worse, create ambiguous standards and rules so companies won't know what they're supposed to do, which will be paralyzing. That's what the companies are afraid we're heading into with this particular rule. So administration is being accused of a major process foul, and I think it's a case where the companies probably have a good argument. What the rule is designed to do is put further restrictions on the export of technology and chips, mostly graphic processing units, GPUs, that would be further enabling for the development of artificial intelligence in other countries, obviously, since we're talking about exports. And to do this expansion, they've done a couple novel things. I don't want to go through the whole reg. We don't have time for that. But they've basically divided the world into three parts, which are kind of predictable parts. One part is friends and allies that are trusted trade partners for whom there won't be any controls. And that's 18 countries, which are Australia, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Ireland, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Korea, Spain, Sweden, Taiwan, and the UK. So interestingly, not the EU as a whole, but selected countries within the EU, mostly but not entirely NATO members. Ireland is not a NATO member, for example, and the Asian countries are not NATO members, but they are friends and allies, and they are trusted partners that will not have to adhere to these new requirements. Then that's category one. Category three is the countries on the naughty list, the countries where we have an arms embargo or are, states that are supporters of international terrorism. And for the wonks out there, this is BIS's D5 plus Macau list. And for them, these chips and technologies are banned. So then the second category is everybody in between, the countries that are not big-time trusted partners, but neither are they on the bad guys list. And their BIS is engaging in basically a series of limitations, mostly in terms of quotas, on their ability to access the computational power and the chips that provide it over the next couple of years at least, or until this is revised. So, among other things, if you're an entity that is engaged in AI and might be building a data center, this is an example of that, for example. If you are headquartered in one of the 18 countries that I referred to, then you can be considered a universal verified end user, which permits you to place up to 7% of your global AI computational capacity in countries around the world, not the category 3 countries, but in other countries that are not in the trusted partner category. In practical terms, that means you can move hundreds of thousands of chips to those places. If you are the same kind of entity, but are not headquartered in one of the 18, but are somewhere else, you can, if the United States government decides to do so, be classified as a national verified end user, which would allow you to purchase computational power equivalent to up to 320,000 advanced GPUs over the next 2 years. So these are kind of quota-like limits. For countries that are in category 2, that not talking about the special entities that I just described, but in general, those other countries, mostly end users in those countries can annually import up to 1,700 of the most advanced AI accelerated chips, which is a lot of, when you add it up in dollar terms, that's tens of millions of dollars, a lot of money. But it's a quota, and you can only go that high, and that's it. And there are a variety of exceptions to that you have to read the rule to get a full grasp of. If you are a non-verified end user and not in one of the 18 countries, you would be allowed to import up to 50,000 advanced GPUs. So again, it's not zeroing all these countries out, but it's limiting them in two ways. It's limiting them in their capacity to develop their own AI industries, if that's the right word. And it is at the same time necessarily limiting their ability to pass these chips on in any significant quantities to countries that we don't want to have them. And that's what the quotas do. So it's a complicated regulation. It does a lot of things. The issue that will be debated endlessly, that we'll know the answer to in a couple of years, although I think companies can predict it now, is this actually going to do any good? Or is it simply going to create new opportunities for workarounds And he's going to create an incentive for China in particular to accelerate its own AI development process in order to maintain its role in the field. And, nobody knows the answers to those questions. I think it's fair to say that the companies believe the answer is going to be the latter, and that what we're really doing here is two things. We're incentivizing the Chinese to move faster. We may be incentivizing other countries to cheat. And at the same time, what is also a product of this is we are capping the revenue of the American companies, which is going to affect their future investment. So on the whole, this is being an unusually poorly received regulation on both policy grounds and on process grounds.
I don't know the ins and outs as nearly as well as Bill does, but what I recalled was this is an industry, the technology sector, advanced computing, where it changes so fast and moves in its own direction in many ways. And it's so easy to get it catastrophically wrong. And I'm just not convinced with the number of objections that are being raised that we've got it right. I recall Andy Grove was one of the pioneers at Intel. He and Gordon Moore and a few others jumped out of Fairchild Semiconductor to form Intel and were revolutionary at the beginning.
And a Hungarian refugee, by the way.
Yes, he's an amazing guy. But his memoir has a wonderful title, which is Only the Paranoid Survive. Okay. And the reason he used that as a title, as he describes the industry, is you can't see around corners, even if you're at the top of the industry. And there are little turns and twists of the market that change the direction entirely of a whole industry. And so I don't know if our commerce officials have gotten this one right. It feels like they haven't given the level of objections. And getting it wrong is worse than just not doing anything. I do agree with the importance of this from an arms control and military readiness standpoint. But boy, it feels like we don't have this one pinned down. And it's easy. Knowledgeable companies make huge mistakes. Intel and NVIDIA, you look at their performance over the last 3 years. NVIDIA focused on design and increased market cap by $3 trillion. Intel tried to do manufacturing and design at a high level and lost $150 billion, and the CEO got fired. It's a brutal industry. That's a 3-year span, which is a blink of an eye. And it changes so fast, I'm not sure that we've got it right now. And I'm not sure we know what to do when it looks like we got it wrong. So this is worrisome.
Well, as always, ending on an optimistic note. Thank you, guys. That is a wrap for this week. We'll let Bill enjoy the rest of his birthday. Not that this hasn't been enjoyable. And we'll see you next week.
Happy birthday, Bill.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.